Center for African Legal Studies at the UPSA Law School was established to promote research, advocacy, and training into legal and developmental issues concerning the African continent. It is important for us to highlight African perspectives on our legal systems and policies, and to develop policy responses and solutions to the problems that are confronting the continent.
The UPSA Law School has a number of initiatives aimed at engaging members of the general public. Some of these initiatives are the UPSA Quarterly Banking Roundtable, the Eminent Guest Lecture Series, the Tax Conference, the Constitution Day Public Lecture, as well as the Point of Law Series.
The UPSA Law School takes a lot of pride in terms of how we treat our students. The whole essence is to promote a total student experience. These are our customers, these are the reasons we're here. And so the UPSA Law School ensures that we operate a model or a system that places students at the center of the things we do. And this also ensures that our students are very happy as they pursue their legal education with us, and that they actually do have the expected dividends that comes with legal education.
The UPSA Law Students Union is a growing bastion of hope, a scepter of knowledge, and a creator of an enabling environment where members of a union are able to interact and participate at the global stage. 3 years after its inception, we have been able to successfully roll out the UPSA Law Students Union Forum, which is an innovative platform reaching out to the world through legal advocacy and conference.
We consider the Law Students Union as an important
Thank you so much. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the second Africa Trade Roundtable. My name is Nicola Suku. I'm a socioeconomic rights researcher and community organizer, and I also serve as the lead representative of the Afronomics Law Academic Forum. It's a network of young lawyers and scholars from the continent who work in the field of international economic law. So I'm very grateful to be here and to be moderating the discussion today. As many of us here will know, the Africa Trade Roundtable is a leading forum on engagement relating to law and policy of African trade. And it's really been a pivotal platform assembling leading thinkers on trade, including the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or the Afcfta, as well as the Vice President of Ghana. And our speakers today are no different, or no exception to that caliber of exceptional guests. Today's seminar is co-hosted between the UPSA Law School and the Trade Union Congress in Ghana. It is going to be, we also partnering, have a media partner, which is Joy Business, and it's going to be live streamed on a few platforms. So it will be on the UPSA Law Facebook page. It will be on the Joy Business Facebook page, which is My Joy Online. And it'll also be on the UPSA Law School YouTube page. And as we all know, the topic today is towards zero barriers, Afcfta, and regional trade unions. We're going to be discussing the role of trade unions in both the development and the successful implementation of the Afcfta, and understanding and questioning and challenging how the Afcfta can properly seize the different dynamics of trade unions across the continent, and really take advantage of their differences and just what they have to offer to the successful implementation of the Afcfta. So to get started, I'm happy to call on Dr. Prince Sscft. He is the Deputy Director of Research at the Trade Union Congress of Ghana, and he will be speaking on behalf of Dr. Anthony Yauba, who is the Secretary General of the Trade Union Congress, but who can't be with us today. So Dr. Prince Sscft, please come in.
All right, okay, thank you and good afternoon to everyone. Well, before I proceed, I'm not PhD yet. I just handed in my thesis, so waiting for the examiners to tell me that I am. Until then, I'm standing in for the Secretary General of the Trade Union Congress Ghana, Dr. Yao. He will certainly have loved to be part of this meeting, but as you are aware, the job of the Secretary General entails a lot, so he is held up somewhere else. He will want me to communicate to your audience that the TUC is happy to work with the University of Professional Studies on the important issue of trade among African countries within the framework of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Some of you may be aware that the TUC has worked on trade for several years. We joined the International Trade Union movement to campaign against unjust trade rules at the level of the WTO. We have also been quite visible in the campaigns against some of the issues on the economic partnership agreement between Africa and then the European Union. So trade issues are not new to us in the trade unions. So it is on the basis of our previous work and the special interest we have in international trade that we were very happy to join with the UPSA in this regard. We all know that Africa's marginalization in the world affairs is most evident when one looks at the statistics on economic development and also particularly also in trade. So you look at Africa's share of global trade had fallen from about 6% in the mid-1980s to just about 3% currently. The period of trade liberalization and indeed economic liberalization coincided with the fall in our share of global trade. Intra-African trade has also remained low. It's only just about 15% of the total trade in 2016. This compares to 61% for the European Union, about 40% for NAFTA, and then 23% for the Asian region. These poor numbers is reflected in the constant deficits in the current accounts and also the endless depreciation of currencies on the continent. Indeed, data from the African Union shows that from the period 2013 to 2019, Africa's trade balance posited deficit of about $105 billion. These also lead to collapse of domestic production, rising joblessness, and high levels of poverty. In 2018, about 40% of African population were in extreme poverty, living on just about $1.90 US a day. In absolute terms, about 433 million Africans were classified as extremely poor in 2018. And of course, the COVID pandemic has also added to the numbers. So it is in this context that we find the African Continental Free Trade Agreement very important. Because it builds on Africa's immense potential to trade among themselves in ways that will transform the structure of output and also trade itself. The overall objective of the agreement is to reverse the marginalization of Africa in the world trade and to drive growth and development on the continent. The main medium is the expansion of intra-African trade. The Afcfta represents by far the most ambitious attempt at the continental level to forge intra-African trade. It offers the opportunity for Africa to circumvent the constraints it faces in the unbalanced rules of the WTO and the emerging mega regional agreements. But there are also challenges. So we have issues with low productive capacity on the continent. We also tend to export similar commodities And of course, we have infrastructure constraints that can inhibit the movement of goods and persons across the continent. And these challenges have contributed to the low level of intra-African trade. Efforts towards addressing the challenges have been limited and uncoordinated. Political considerations have always preceded and dominated the economics of integration and trade activities on the continent. So we expect that the African Trade Agreement will transform African group from dependence on commodities to manufacturers, bringing about labor-intensive manufacturing, and even intensive agriculture could produce more and better jobs for young people on the continent. Nonetheless, the Afcfta could potentially produce employment challenges, including bringing about reduced wages, especially for low-skilled labor as countries switch to high-skilled manufacturers. And of course, issues about competition and race to the bottom are real things that we have to take into account as we discuss the trade agreement. So on this basis, we at the TUEC will continue our advocacy on these challenges and the important issues of employment and labor rights in the trade agreement. We hope to get more insight from the panelists assembled for this afternoon discussions. And in order to enrich our own work that we are doing on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That really put us in a good stead to get the conversation going. I would love to welcome Professor Kofi Abutsi, the Dean of UPSA Law School, to give some further welcoming remarks before we start our roundtable. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you very much, moderator. And we at UPSA are delighted to have all of you join us for this afternoon's conversation on yet another very important topic that affects African trade. We at UPSA Law School are determined to take a leadership role in coordinating key policy conversations on the issues that affect African trade, and particularly under the aegis of the Afcfta. Having heard my friend speak from the Trade Union Congress of Ghana, it appears that Ghana is determined to play a pivotal role under the Afcfta, and it's my hope that indeed all trade union bodies across the continent are equally determined. And the fact that we have joining us and indeed gracing us with their distinguished presence, people of high eminence as far as African trade is concerned, agreeing to speak on this platform today is a testament to that new commitment. The statistics have been mentioned and there's no need to repeat them, but clearly Africa is lagging behind and is doing something fundamentally wrong. The Afcfta is designed, as far as I understand, to provide an about turn from this downward trend and downward spiraling of the continent in all things global commerce. It's important that Africa recognizes that trade is such an important factor in development, and the peripheral treatment of trade over the years clearly hasn't helped the continent in its own developmental efforts. Having said this, it's also useful for us to remember that trade can both help and hurt. And it helps when you are well positioned and adjusted to compete. Trade will hurt when you do not have the competitive wherewithal and you are ill prepared. Some countries on the continent were a bit slow in signing the Afcfta, partly because they were not quite sure if their domestic industries were ready for the competition. That is where trade unions come in. Trade unions are supposed to help assuage the fears and the disquiet that some countries have and some trading stakeholders have on the Afcfta arrangement. Barriers will continue to be a problem, and there will be all kinds of non-structural barriers that will be placed in the way of people seeking to do legitimate business across the continent. This conversation today excites me indeed, and I'm glad that we have the kind of experts and expertise that we've assembled who can do justice to the topic. It is my expectation that trade unions across the continent will be able to pull together the various stakeholders to leverage the advantages that are offered under the Afcfta arrangement, so that at the end of the day, Africa can also compete globally and also fundamentally compete among itself, since intra-African trade is as low as African trade with the rest of the world. So on behalf of my team at UPSA, and on behalf of everyone gathered here today, I'd like to welcome all of you to this afternoon's conversation. And it is my hope, as I'm going to listen in very attentively, that by the end of this, we would have all learned a lot. And not only that, but our policy audience would have also taken a lot from this so that we can practically implement the Afcfta for the benefit of the entire continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean. I now have the honor of welcoming our 4 guests to our roundtable. We have with us Dr. Michael Akupa. He is the director of the Labor Resource and Research Institute in Namibia. We have Dr. Kwabena Otto, the director of the Labor Policy and Research Institute, the Trade Union Congress, Ghana. We have Caroline Kamati Mugala, who is the executive director of East African Trade Union Confederation. And we have Hameda Didat, the acting executive director of the National Labor and Economic Development Institute, or NALEDI. So we're just so happy to have these guests and so grateful to all of them for joining us. Thank you so much. And really, we want this to be very conversational. As has already been said in the chat, for any of the attendees, if you have questions, please do post them in the chat. We may pick them up as we go, but we'll also have a dedicated time towards the end of discussing those questions. But then also to our speakers, as we've already said, we were happy to steer the conversation in whatever direction you would like it to go. So maybe just to get us started, Hamida, I'm wondering if you could please just give us, just so we all are on the same page, an introduction into what is the Afcfta in relation to trade unions.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon or good evening to everybody joining us. So what I wanted to do is, am I able to screen share?
Yes, let me just, someone should be able to make you co-host quickly if you don't have that option already.
Should be. I'm just trying to find the document I wanted to screen share.
At the bottom right in green. Otherwise, you should be made, someone should make you co-host quickly.
You should be able to share.
Yeah.
It's not the one I'm wanting to, so I'm just right. So I just want to see if I can find the. Sorry, I'm just trying to find this lovely document that I had here with the Sscft. I don't seem to be finding it because I had quite a few documents. This is actually the one from the Department of Trade and Industry. It's a formal document, but basically, let me speak to it unofficially, and then maybe at some point I can actually just share some of the documents that I've actually put together. So I mean, in 20, what I actually had was a Third World Network Africa, which is currently based in Ghana. I mean, you have such an available resource. I mean, you've got researchers, you've got lawyers, all focusing quite extensively on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I must say, Dean, I've got a slightly different perspective when it comes to international trade. I mean, international trade under globalization, but also just generally, is a tool that's supposed to be used for development. But because we're faced within a neoliberal framework, we know that the powers that be, countries that are much more powerful than we are, countries who actually own, if you take West Africa as an example, who own our economies or own our currencies, are able to put in place and in some instances with some influence trade agreements at such a level and with such force that in actual fact the power relations of inequality between the North and the South, between the developed and developing countries, is what we then see permeated within trade agreements. So historically, for those who, if this is the first time that you're engaging, I mean, we normally had multilateral trade agreements under the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, and they normally have the GATT, which is in relation to trade in goods and services. So they trade in goods is GATT. Then you've got GATS, which is your trade in services. You've got a specific agreement called Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, which speaks to investment and intellectual property. At some point, they had an investment measures, which was TRIMS. You have an agreement on agriculture, and then you also had more recently, as I indicated, the issue around GATS. Now, the General Agreement on Trades and Services. Now, when the WTO started to advance multilateral trading systems against, within the WTO system as a multilateral trading system, when we got to the Doha round, we, as one of the key momentum, or you can see a milestone in our history, in terms of African countries and developing countries largely contesting a multilateral trading system that was absolutely unfair, there was a demand for a developmental round. Now, since the Doha round, the WTO has subsequently met, and in many instances, rounds have collapsed. And that's because liberalization in and of itself has not been beneficial for Africa. So in many instances, the multilateral trading system, which is supposed to be growth and development, is only leading to further exploitation and what many of us would call colonialism of a different form, or perpetuation of colonialism through trade as an instrument. And globalization is just perpetuating it. And rather than asking for equal development and equal opportunities and for growth, particularly by historically disadvantaged countries, I would say impoverished and underdeveloped purposefully, we find ourselves being more and more exploited as opposed to being able to find the equal footing. So when the multilateral trading system as the WTO started to fail, and because there was a lot of pushback coming from the developing world, and there was a lot more contestation, a lot more coherence, and African countries or developing countries contesting, what then happened is the global system moved into what they call bilateral trading systems. So we then saw something called the Economic Partnerships in Africa as a key bilateral within Africa that the EU was trying to push. So as opposed to having trading systems or trade agreements enforced at the WTO level, they were then moving into EPAs for Africa. We also saw in relation to the negotiation on GATS, there was a particular investment agreement that had come in. I think it was under the 4 Singapore issues, and Africa and developing countries had forcefully pushed back against this. So what we now find is, as much as we've been, obviously those of us who work in the area and have been contesting, have come up, I think in 2007, 2008, as a way of contesting the current macroeconomic framework and trade liberalization. What we were then putting forward was, how about we do regional integration? And I think it's really important, that reference is made to the lack of intra-African trade. Now that is purposeful, right? If you go to every single African country and you look at the levels of informalization and you look at what goods are being sold, it's largely goods that have been imported, goods that are dumped, goods that are easily available, coming from China, Brazil, India, and many other countries. And the way in which they're being dumped in Africa is that we do not have the competitive advantage to be able to produce goods at such a cheap level. As a result of that, we specialize in poverty, right? So trying to have formal industries with workers earning, and if you're talking from a labor perspective, if you're wanting to have a social clause or you're wanting to have social security where workers are demanding a decent standard of living, within a liberalized system, you're placing workers in Africa against workers in China. So I remember, historically when we used to talk about Nike, workers in the EPZs, economic partnership, the free zones, workers in China working for Nike as an example. I mean, this is not relevant. It's not something that's probably happening now, but it used to happen. It's a very good way to demonstrate. Workers in China were earning a bowl of rice. Workers in South Africa, for example, in the context of shoes, were probably earning 3,000 Rand. So when you have to compete with the cost of paying a worker a bowl of rice vis-a-vis paying them 1,000 Rand, which is maybe which is less than $100. But I mean, if you're having to do that comparison, then chances are investors or capitalists would rather go for paying workers a bowl of rice. Because when you pay workers a bowl of rice, it means that the money or the profits that you'd be appropriating is way higher than what you would appropriate if you were paying workers a living wage or a decent wage. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, just to bring us back to the whole point, is because there's been major contestation at the multilateral trading level, as well as against the EPAs, we now find, and I think it's over a long period of time, as much as they've pushed in the EPAs, they've now come with something that's almost like a WTO across the African continent, calling it an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And what we need to understand is when anything is devised by somebody outside of us as Africans, something that is externally driven and something that is pushed through very, very fast without proper consultation, without proper engagement, and in some instances also kept, certain parts of the information are kept basically hidden, so that eventually by the time you actually get to look at what the specificities are of what's sitting in that trade agreement, you actually realize that countries have signed. I think when you also see that there's bullying between countries, and when certain countries who might have taken a decision where they do not want to sign up to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and have taken a very strong position, when they find themselves blackmailed either by the IMF or the World Bank or countries that they're in international trade with, deciding actually, you know what, if you don't sign the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, then we won't, for example, in terms of AGOA, we won't renew the AGOA treaty, etc., etc. So when you find this bullying tactics, and countries in the South are being forced, or the developing countries are being forced to actually sign onto something that in actual fact we're not ready for, but secondly is along the same business as usual scenario of neoliberalism, and which is going to perpetuate the inequalities that we currently see, then we have a fundamental problem. We also need to note that in terms of our economies in Africa, that a large percentage of our African countries have a large informal economy. We do not have structured economies. We do not specialize in manufacturing. And with an agricultural base where the same products or many of the similar products are being competed, you have countries competing with each other for exactly the same products. We end up specializing in poverty rather than specializing in manufacturing or being able to develop certain expertise. I think if one then looks at the issue of climate change, it then just worsens, because you'd find that Africa has or large parts of Africa, excluding South Africa, has a practically zero climate footprint. But when you look at the whole carbon trading aspect, when you look at the waste of, the dumping of e-waste, all of these things are being facilitated quite extensively through trade agreements, and it's going to get worse. I mean, if one wants to get more technical, if you just take for example, if you take the issue of international just trade, for example, in terms of agriculture, we know that you're supposed to have special and differentiated treatment under a multilateral system where certain least developed countries would get certain preferences when trading with, maybe it's bananas or coconut or cocoa. When you're trading this with developing countries, there are specific conditions that developed countries, or even under the WTO, that you would be given by virtue of the fact that there's recognition that you're a least developed country. Now, in Africa, if we have so many countries sitting on a least developed contingent, right, and also we don't have the same level of sophistication in terms of special or differential treatment. We don't have proper tariff barriers. There's no customs control. There's a whole range of modalities and capacities that are required from an African perspective before one can actually take advantage, even within our countries on our own. Yet, these things are starting to happen. I think just to give you another specific example of why there's a disconnect. I mean, I think 2 years ago, we were actually attending an FES meeting. And while the people from the AU, people from the Department of Trade and Industry, and in fact, even the WTO officials were basically articulating why the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement was very good for us, Ghana and Nigeria, which are very close to each other, were actually not the countries, but the people were in contestation. There were people who, because there was a disagreement between the traders, informal traders trading tomatoes, you found that the contestation became at such a level that people weren't able to bring tomatoes from one part of Nigeria into Ghana. Eventually, it spilled onto becoming quite a political issue, and then fuel was basically cut. You weren't allowed to then bring petrol into Ghana, but people were then, going and collecting fuel illegally and bringing it into Ghana and then dropping the price of fuel. So the thing is, it's one thing to have an agreement which is which is top level and driven by bureaucrats and specialists, when the people on the ground who are actually going to be affected quite substantively, when we talk about workers, when you talk about workers in the informal economy and ordinary people across the continent who do not have a clue that this particular agreement is coming or what this agreement could mean for us on our day-to-day level, you can sign agreements here.
Just because this is a really interesting topic, and I want us to speak a little bit about the difference, the kind of incongruencies between what people on the ground are experiencing. I'm going to ask you to wrap up so we can maybe spend a little bit of get some more insights on this topic, if you don't mind.
No, not a problem. In fact, that was actually my final point. It was just to indicate that because people, you've got officials, WTO, AU, Department of Trade and Industry, politicians making agreements, but people are completely disconnected from it. And it's the lives of ordinary people and workers that are going to be affected by this trade agreement. And that's why a discourse and an engagement of this nature is absolutely important, so that we can actually start talking and actually, having the discussions around what this would actually mean, noting the fact that the agreement has already been signed and seemingly ratified. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much for that context, because I hope we do have time to engage both with the question of are we ready, but also with the question of, well, we're here now and what do we do? But maybe before we get there, perhaps some of the other speakers could also just come in and give us, and you can as well, to what extent were trade unions in your region consulted in the development of the Afcfta, and how has that engagement or lack thereof informed people's position towards it, or unions' position towards the Afcfta? So I'm happy with whomever can come in first. But if we want to do it in the order that I introduced you, perhaps Dr. Ukupa can come in. Akupa, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we owe it to really extend our gratitude and appreciation to UPSA and Ghana TUC for inviting us, but also because the event is being hosted in West Africa, to also appreciate the inputs and support we have been getting from Third World Network in Ghana. As we started to, from the time we started to engage on the topic of the Sscft. Now, I think from the context of Namibia, it's very important first and foremost to consider what the government has been doing since the talks of the Sscft started at the AU level. Now, this is a topic that has not been engaged in, whether it is at the business level or trade union level or just generally. And even when you look at the time when it was ratified in the parliament, it was ratified during the time when people were largely on year-end vacation. So that in itself has demonstrated that the Namibians did not really engage on the subject matter. Now, I think it is also worth mentioning that from us as the Labour Resource and Research Institute and our friends at the Third World Network have been able to organize activities here in Windhoek, where I remember one, we also actually invited the African, the AU Commission to come and speak to workers about the implications and the impact of the Sscft should the country ratify this pact. Now, even at the time, it was also not really very easy to get representations of government and trade unions in the same room. But there has been a slight improvement after we had identified focal persons that we would like to be dealing with, or that we could be dealing with from the government side. But largely in the trade unions, the subject has not been dealt with, even though we as a labor service organization has really been trying to do our best. It's only very few unions who could really even attempt to ask questions to the effect. But after the agreement has been ratified, we started now to really see interest developing from the trade unions wanting to engage in the subject of Sscft. For example, I can report now that through one federation, Trade Union Confederation of Namibia, TUCNA, and the ITUC Africa, we were able to do some research work that pertains to impacts of these agreements to workers, the narrative of the world of work, and also related matters such as rules that will guide products that will be engaged in the regime of this agreement. Now, I think sometimes it is when one mentions something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are complaining or you are mourning, but is to indicate and show why it remains important for workers not to be left out of this conversation. Now, we know that the Sscft secretariat is in Ghana, and we know that the boss of the secretariat has been engaging with regional blocs on the continent. But now, for example, when the boss was here in Namibia, the workers did not attend this event, and it's a pity that they have not been invited to be part of it. And what we are learning, for example, is that many of the rules that are going to govern this engagement are those will likely be those of the Southern African Custom Union. So, which means the effect probably for the member countries of the custom unions are going to be the same. But then maybe we have to now also consider that Namibia is a country that produces certain products. We are not yet sure as of now as to how they will be classified in those regimes. Now, and this is where the trade unions should start to engage in. For example, if it comes to things like beef, how should the agriculture sector reform? In minerals, how should the demand or the mineral sector reform? And I think these are some of the important issues we need to start engaging. Now that the agreement has already been ratified and it's functional, maybe it is no longer important to continue complaining, but maybe to look for the space of trade unions in the bigger scheme of things. And I think this advocacy should really be escalated so that workers are not left out, whether it is at the level of representation of the continent or whether it is through representation of regional worker organizations, so that the voice of the workers can make its way in the bigger scheme of things, and so that also the workers also have a say in produce that is going to form part of this very important agreement as we move on. I think, moderator, I will end there for now, anticipating further conversation. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. That perspective was really helpful, and it'll be interesting to hear from Hamida whether that's quite consistent with Southern Africa. But perhaps Dr. Otu, if you could come in and give your perspective from West Africa. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, straight to your question about consultations. That is the most significant feature of the Sscft. The fact that it was just at the level of high level of political level, AU, trade ministries across the continent, even to the extent that the regional economic groupings like the ECOWAS that have been at the forefront of liberalization within the sub-regions were themselves not properly consulted on the overall architecture of the Sscft. The trade unions were not consulted at all. And I mean, even for business associations, the attempt to consult them took the form of creating a new business structure, bypassing existing business associations that have been at the forefront of talking about integration in Africa. So that's the weakest side of the Sscft as an agreement. So having said that, if once you open it up, you realize that there are many deficiencies simply because the main actors with a strong interest and with strong views on trade, not just regional integration. I mean, the Secretary General mentioned that we have been at the forefront of campaigning and protesting around trade for a very long time. Trade unionists were at Cancun, ministerial were at Singapore. So more or less, people with strong interests, with strong views were completely sidelined. And I'm sure that we will see the effects of such lack of consultation as the agreement is rolled out and we begin the implementation process.
Sure, thank you so much. Ms. Mugala, maybe you could come in and tell us both the perspective from East Africa, but also whether there has been any advocacy to leverage and to get the voice of labor included more, and whether there's been receptivity to that advocacy, and whether it's made any difference in terms of who is included in consultations.
I think the issue around consultation of trade unions, my colleagues have extensively talked about it. It's the same story even from my region in terms of trade union participation. But as trade unions, we are in the process of building our own capacity, as my colleagues have also alluded to with the cooperation of ITUC, Africa, Third World Network. Currently, we have, from our region, we have Rwanda as one of the country where the trade union is piloting a project working on the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and we'll be having a capacity building seminar towards the end of October. So we are in our own spaces trying to build the capacity of the trade union to be able to effectively engage, because there's the issue of availability of spaces, but there's also the question, do you have the capacity to engage within these spaces? But also as a region, I'm happy to have followed the speech of my General Secretary of the East African Community at the just concluded meeting in Ghana, which brought together all the RECs. So as Kwabena has said, there's some effort now to try and reach out to the RECs, because these are the building blocks towards the full implementation of a free trade area within Africa. Because we already, as regions, we already have our own, free trade areas where we're already implementing this. But even with the East African community, which is considered to be one of the most advanced, REC within the region, we still have our own challenges, even fully implementing the custom union that we have. So if EAC is having challenges in terms of fully implementing the customs union that is in place and the common market protocol that are in place, what makes us think we can do it, on a continental stage? So it's very important, and this has been the message that is coming out of the East African community from the Secretariat and, through the trade unions, the civil society, the business Council of East Africa, we have to strengthen the regional economic regs to push the full implementation of the common market agreement. So in terms of moving forward, it's very important to have structured mechanism for systematic and effective participation by all stakeholders, trade unions, civil society, the private sector, but also looking at who are these private sectors that will be engaged, because my colleague Kwabena has talked about the kind of business entities that were actually consulted or were on the table during negotiations. So we need to involve a private sector that is an African private sector that is speaking for Africa, not a private sector that is driving other interests that are not African interests in terms of going forward. And this mechanism should actually, operate from not only at the continental level, because the discussion has been more at the continental level, the ministers of trade. We need to bring this discussion down to the shop floor. As trade unions say, we need to bring it back to the grassroots for people to understand exactly what are the opportunities that the Continental Free Trade Agreement is offering to us, and trying to avoid some of the challenges that Hamid alluded to, of traders in Ghana, the issue in South Africa. We have the same challenges of cross-border traders in East Africa, even though we have, a common market. So looking at mechanisms that operate at national, regional, to continental level, this. Where I come from in Kenya, there's this narrative about bottoms up. So we are looking at, that kind of bottoms-up participation and engagement of grassroots organization, national organization, regional organization, sub-regional organization, and continental organization. And this effort should also include women groups, farmers, workers, small and medium enterprises, national, domestic producers, because trade liberalization will largely affect those, domestic producers in terms of, and other strategic marginalized group as well, and other vulnerable socioeconomic constituency. And I was really happy to read the speech of the head of the Secretariat, His Excellency Mene, who exclusively mentioned trade unions as one of the key stakeholders. So it's really important to bring down the discussions to the people, and who are the better placed organization than the trade union to be able to bring this message down to the people, because we speak for the people. We are just not, what we call a briefcase organization. We represent the interest of people. East Africa Trade Union Confederation, for example, represents over 4.5 million workers in East Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would love us to speak a bit more about what has been done and what has been done in lieu of the type of consultation that we would have liked to imagine. But maybe just before we get there, we can take a step back to some of the provocations that Hamida was getting us towards, which is the first part of this event title is Towards Zero Barriers. And maybe we can just, from the perspectives of you all, the whole idea of Towards Zero Barriers, maybe we could discuss whether, first of all, that is possible, and second of all, that is desirable, especially given the position of trade unions before the Afcfta towards trade liberalization in general. And what are general feelings towards that? Yeah, more generally, whether it's desirable, whether it's possible, whether it's realistic, and whether we're ready for it. I'm happy for anyone to come in here. Yeah, Hamida, if you want to come in.
Yeah, thanks very much. So somebody else, but I mean, this is a frightening notion of zero barriers. I mean, South Africa, just as an example, and I mean, we've gone through it, and I mean, it's a lot of African countries as well in terms of structural adjustments. So we had under apartheid protectionism in our clothing, footwear, and textile industries, as an example. When we ended apartheid and we went into our so-called new democracy, one of the key things that was introduced was liberalization. So South Africa had protectionism as a very strong, I mean, it was protectionism by virtue of the fact that we had sanctions and people were not trading with us. But as a result of the fact, our economy was protected. But what we did is we did accelerated trade liberalization, and we're still struggling in the clothing, footwear, and textile industries to recover. So if you then take, so that's one sector. Now, if you take our dairy sector or agriculture as an example, or even steel, when you start reducing tariffs, it basically means your competitive advantage, particularly for sectors that are either developing or that would not be able to compete or are not used to competition, are going to be eroded. South Africa currently, as a result of COVID, has over almost 50% unemployment. We're heading to catastrophe, right? We've got high levels of youth unemployment. There's illiteracy. There's a growing informality and precarity and casualization, particularly from a labor perspective. Now, I was just reading something where they're saying that in the next 5 years, that's 90% of Africa trade will be with minimal import duties. I mean, this is dangerous if we haven't even worked out what your rules of origin is. To give you an example, again, just using the case of South Africa, we had, in terms of our customs duties, Parmalat recognized when it started to export milk, powdered milk into South Africa, it recognized that in terms of our customs duties a couple of years ago, that we did not differentiate between baby milk powder or baby milk formula and milk powder. So there was no way of testing the difference, right? So what they did was they brought in normal milk powder as baby formula at zero duty, then set up factories and were able to do, they then produced highly processed foods like cheese, yogurt, long life milk, etc. And then they flooded our markets with this and basically killed off so many South African domestic producers. And initially, as a user, you think competition is good because it actually drops the price. But what it actually leads to is monopoly capitalism. So you then have a monopoly of the market. You then have competition between, and in fact, you actually have price fixing. And the key was when producers fix the prices and consumers then lose out. So eventually, they will set the market. You won't actually have choice, and we will be in a major catastrophe. So in terms of Africa, if you just take, I think it was either Namibia or Zimbabwe, there was the case of chicken. There was chicken that was brought from Brazil, came to South Africa. I think the way we picked it up was because of the bird flu, right? So what happened is the chicken was then exported, and then when they traced it, the intertrade was South Africa exporting chicken to one of the Southern African countries, but in actual fact, it was chicken that came from Brazil. So if you don't have sufficient modalities and trade facilitation and customs and rules of origin, the key legislative framework or the regulatory framework around those things, we're going to land up with massive liberalization happening within African markets, and we're basically going to become a free market for the rest of the world. So I think this is going to be, and for workers, it's going to place us in major contestation with each other, because it's, again, specializing and competing with a race to the bottom. And usually what happens is, the touting of foreign direct investment as being your developmental path, we'll all start competing again for foreign direct investment. And we'll be offering the lowest wages in order to be able to secure some kind of investment in order to have jobs. So I think, speaking to Michael's point, and I think Caroline's point as well, if you're talking about what does this mean for us as trade unions, and this would be my last point, I think we need to reconfigure the way we think. Capital has reconfigured themselves. You find capital moving across borders. We still think of capital within borders. They are multinational corporations, meaning they've got multi-nations. They operate without an identity, and they have they exploit. The only way that we would be able to contest is if we start organizing around global value chains, and if we organize along those global value chains as African trade unions, collectively fighting for the social security, which we must argue is not going to be a technical barrier to trade, because I know under the WTO there was a time when they actually argued that social security clauses were actually technical barriers to trade. So I think we really need to, noting what's currently happening, and at a very, very fast pace, we need to get our act together. I'm really positive. It's really positive to hear that I think in terms of ECOWAS and in terms of SADC with Namibia, that there's a lot more engagement, and I think probably in Ghana as well. Sadly, in the context of South Africa, despite the fact that our DTI and our president is, quite prominent in the AU, we're not getting the same level of consultation. And in fact, in terms of COSATU, it's almost minimal in terms of the Xenophobic. Thanks very much.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yes, I was going to ask you to come in.
Okay, so I mean, the question about zero tariffs or zero barriers, I mean, the statistics that was given clearly show that in the 1980s, Africa's share of global trade was about 6%. And this was the period Africa was deemed illiberal. We had closed ourselves up. Now we were forced under structural adjustment to liberalize our trade and remove all the barriers to trade. And since then, our share of global trade has halved to about 3%. In fact, it was 2.9% in 2018. So what it tells you is that this whole mantra of zero barriers, liberalization, actually there's a problem with it. And the Professor Kofi Abochi mentioned that something fundamentally wrong has happened. At the time when you are liberalizing, your share of trade has actually gone down. It means that there's a problem we need to tackle. Now, the whole idea that we need to liberalize in order to develop actually does not cohere with history. The history of development is that all the countries that have successfully developed actually did so behind high tariff barriers. So the British industrialized before liberalizing. In the 1880s, when Germany and France sought to liberalize, they realized quickly that they were losing out and they reversed course. The United States actually industrialized behind high tariff wars in the 19th and later part of the 20th century. So like Professor Kofi Abochi said, trade can both hurt and it can help. It helps you when you are in a capacity to trade. You have something to trade. Your productive capacity is stronger. We live in a continent today where nearly everything, the basic of things, are imported from China. Now, if you liberalize and you remove all the barriers to trade, in the absence of a watertight rules of origin, as Hamida mentioned, we are yet to define clear rules of origin. Where do the goods originate from? What it means is that there's the high risk of trade capture. China can just set up in Morocco or somewhere close to Africa and simply take advantage of the barriers that you have removed. And mind you, today, steel product from China, all the way from China, when they land on the shores of Ghana, they are actually cheaper than steel that has been produced in Ghana. It means that we are not really ready to compete. Now, on the African-wide level, there's this assumption that African countries are similar. So in actual fact, we are not likely to have challenges. But African countries are not similar. We know that South Africa is stronger. We know Egypt is stronger. We know that there are very, very weak countries. So what is likely going to be the situation is that you will have winners and losers out of this trade liberalization episode that we are embarking on under the Sscft. What is the mechanism to compensate the losers? And we should not take it for granted that the losers will lie low. We know that within ECOWAS, there has been several cases of blockade of Ghanaian product entering Nigeria, and sometimes not even entering Nigeria as a country, actually exiting through Nigeria to Cameroon. Why do the Nigerians do that? One, because they think they are losing out. Two, because they think that Ghana and some other countries have become entry port for European goods. So tomatoes from northern Italy just skip through Ghana and find their way into Nigeria. Okay, so there are several questions. You should not be taken for granted that once you liberalize, you are going to gain. Some countries will gain, some countries will lose out. But there's also the possibility of trade capture by both the Europeans and also the Chinese.
If I may.
Come in.
Okay, thank you very much. Kwabena has just really outlined some of the key issues we in fact have already been debating about in the Africa Labor Research Network. So I just want to take it a little bit further and to ask questions as to what our relationships were as Africans to international trade partners. What industrial policies or trade policies it is that are in place in order for us to be able to make informed thoughts and decisions. I want to bring one example that is happening now. For example, here in Namibia, the country is demarcated by what is called a red line, which has got some colonial history, and it's also considered to be a means to control foot and mouth disease. Now, the so-called prime beef that is produced on the other side of the red line gets access to the prime European market, but the same meat may not make it to other African countries. Now, what is happening at the moment is the meat from the northern communal areas, which is on the other side of the red line, which is now the foot and mouth disease prone area, is what is being exported to other countries on the continent. Now, for example, recently the Meat Corporation here concluded an agreement with Ghana, and that is where they will be sending that meat which is produced from that other part of the country. So already there, you see that there is a problem, and it is not supposed to be like that. There are also issues of migration that will come about. There are also issues of policies that pertains to protection of products that we produce, that we still need to negotiate, and leading to what effect it has on workers. You know, the improvement in salaries, the improvement in the scale of production, the issues of migration. All these things have to be dealt with, and I think this is very important that when we consider barriers, that we also see that that the barriers should not only be looked at lightly. These are very serious things, and removing barriers, the question we should start asking is barriers towards who and against who. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that that's very, very pertinent, barriers towards who. Ms. Mugala, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah. I just wanted to, share maybe one or 2 points. I think my colleagues have already mentioned what is the importance of tariff. I think there are two main importance of tariff: revenue and an opportunity for it's a policy tool and a policy space. And as my colleagues have said in our discussions, we've seen the current form and the process at which the Sscft was arrived to. It was more to drive tariff liberalization and service deregulations. These have been the forefront. We are talking about 90% of goods to be liberalized over a period of 10 years for LDCs and 5 years, non-LDCs. This will have a huge impact in terms of revenue collections that that we already facing challenges in, and only living as a space of 10% in terms of the percentage that we are led with to be able to be innovative around that. What if we get more innovative in a sector that we have already liberalized? What do we do? If Kenya decides now we want to make mobile phones or something, and yet we had already liberalized that particular sector, what then happens? And my colleagues have already talked about the issue of rules of origin. They have not even concluded that, but also the issue around safeguard mechanism. We know from experience that this has already been a problem within the African continent in terms of being able to use these safeguards that are already there effectively. So what makes us think that we have the capacity to be able to actually enforce the safeguard mechanisms? But also looking, taking a practical experience. We now have COVID, an opportunity for us to be able to coordinate, our efforts as Africans. But what did we do? The first thing that was done is the borders were closed. You couldn't move across the border. I come from East Africa. It was very difficult for even the goods themselves to move across the borders. We had an opportunity to have a continental-wide, health economic policy response, but we grappled. There were challenges in even implementing this. So should we take, a step back and actually look at, the process that we have put in place in terms of making sure that we have this Sscft? Should we look at, how unequal in terms of competitive conditions our countries are in, and look at, charting a different path? Should we take a look? If you look at the Lagos and Abuja process, I personally think there were better processes than, the current Continental Free Trade Agreement. But, they say it is what it is. It's here. What can we do? The traditional approaches of Lagos and Abuja had stepwise, strengthening existing recs, gradual liberalization of trade among recs, strengthening sectoral integration at regional and continental levels in all areas, and coordination and harmonization among recs, just to mention a few. But it was, a step-by-step first approach, one stage building on the other stage, testing, reviewing before you jump to the next stage. Thank you, dear.
Thank you. Hamida, did you want to come in on that point? And then there's two other questions I want to traverse too, but maybe if you want to come in on that point.
Yeah, not specifically, but I think as Caroline was talking, what I also remembered is that when we sign the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, right, it doesn't, what the WTO does is a single undertaking. So the moment you provide special treatment, or you have specific trade agreements or relations, or you give concessions to a country that's within the WTO, regardless of whether it falls under the Sscft, it means that same special treatment has to happen to everybody else. So as much as we're talking about an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we must realize that Africa is going to be open, not just to Africans, but under the multilateral trading system and single undertaking, it means we would be opening up exactly the same, to everybody else. I think the second issue under COVID, and it made me think of the issue around West Africa. I mean, current West African countries, the central bank is controlled by France. A lot of the imports and export, a lot of the imports are coming from France, right? So the possibility of all of those goods moving into the rest of Africa, as Africa becomes an open market, is clearly something that we need to be thinking about, because it's not about, it might mean that countries who wouldn't have had access to our markets in the same way that they have to West Africa are going to be engaging. I think if we think that France is not going to be contesting the infiltration of other multinational corporations into their territories in West Africa. I think we also, going to be highly, we're really going to be challenged when it comes to that. I mean, I just wanted to give you another concrete example. There's a company called the name escapes me now. It will come, but there's a particular company in South Africa that's facilitating the movement of goods between South Africa and South African companies and countries in SADC. And there's been goods that have come from, like rice that has come from Mauritius, for example, which is supposed to be tested before it actually leaves the borders of South Africa if it's destined for a Southern African country. But the custom officers in South Africa, for example, are not, if they don't do their job, right? If you don't have an official who's actually conscious and is clear that if you're moving goods from one country to the other, it has to be good, and as in it has to have high quality. So I know of an example where the goods that were coming from Mauritius had 90% water because it was stuck at the harbor. So the water content had increased and the quality, the nutritional value had decreased. And it was only because the person who was working at this company actually made sure that the rice was tested. There's certain parameters and guidelines against which you must stick to be able to, and then it was sent off to a lab to be able to ascertain that the rice was actually conducive to actual human consumption, and if it wasn't, that it had to be returned. At one point, the company that wanted to move the rice actually flew the rice through a courier from Mauritius to South Africa to the company and said, here you go. Here's the authenticity of how good quality the rice is. And it had nothing to do with the rice that was sitting at the harbor. We've had plugs, like irons and kettles that move from South Africa to Zimbabwe, where the plugs are made for South African, plugs. There's no SANS or SABS standards on the other side. And what happens is all they do is they just rip off the plugs when it gets to the other side, and somebody goes and puts on an adapter, and you assume that it's fine. You've had tin fish, that's been moved between borders that had massive lead content because it was either damaged or there was no proper, SANS testing on this side, and people were then eating fish that had lead contamination. Let's not even talk about the goods that move between the borders that are expired. I mean, we know of ShopRite that was moving goods which were expired from South Africa into the rest of Africa. So I think we really have to. The more I think about this, the more concerned I get all over again. But I mean, we've really got major challenges, and I think what's important about this meeting, and I think particularly for us as the trade union movement, without sounding to be a little bit more positive, our work is cut out for us. And the only way we're going to be able to contest and really shift what could fundamentally be devastation for us as Africa is if we come together. I mean, many of us are under the ITUC. There's strong, the SATUC, and I think ECOWAS, there's strong regional, the OTUC, there's quite a strong regional as well as a continental engagement amongst us as trade unions. But I think the prioritization of the Sscft and really having a continental response from labor is starting to become a lot more urgent. I mean, not that I don't know, but I mean, it's just that you're doing 100 things and then you come back to Sscft and you're like, oh my God, it's running away with us. But yeah, thanks.
No, thank you for that. And I do want us to ideally get to speaking about some of the more looking forward, what some of the approaches could be. But Dr. Otu, I'm wondering if you could, before we get there, if you could speak to us specifically about some of the misconceptions amongst unions in different countries, the potential disagreements or biases, and how that's impacting and how that will continue to impact the implementation of the Afcfta and just general effective trade within the continent.
The question is to who?
To you, sir.
Oh, then repeat that question again for me.
I was wondering if you could speak to disagreements and biases and miscommunication amongst and between trade unions in different countries and different regions, and just the effect that has both on trade in general, but also on what you predict it will have on the Afcfta.
Okay, thanks. I mean, luckily for us, within the African trade union movement, we are united in our views when it comes to trade. And let me restate that view. We are not against trade. In fact, it is very, very difficult to talk against trade. We know what trade has done. We know the access to goods and services we do not produce, but which we now are able to have access to. What is clear to us is that even if it is difficult to talk against trade, it is also difficult to defend the current rules under which trade is conducted. Now, the Sscft appears to replicate the same kinds of rules across the continent. And the unions are more or less united in our views when it comes to the approach to liberalization adopted by the Sscft. Again, let me also say that we are not against the Sscft as a concept. The idea is good. I mean, you have a population of about 1.2 billion. That today has become a supermarket for the rest of the world. We need to take advantage of that 1.2 billion people ourselves. And this 1.2 billion people are young people yearning for more development, access to goods and services. We need to take advantage of that. We have an economy of about $2.5 trillion. In fact, the Sscft will become the largest trade agreement in the world if we are successful at implementing it. And if this is the case, then more consultation and discussion should have gone into how we harness the potential. Okay. Now, given the challenges we have had with the sub-regional bodies, we actually had enough data. We actually have enough experiences and lessons to have crafted a good Sscft for ourselves. Okay. So on your question, for us, I mean, it is clear to us that, I mean, there's not much differences between us and amongst us as trade unions. We are seeking a trade agreement that connects the entire continent. A continent where today, if you want to export from Ghana to Tunisia, you first have to get your goods into a warehouse somewhere in France before you bring it back to Tunisia. If you want to export from Ghana to Cameroon, sometimes the goods will have to go all the way to France before you bring it back to. So there are major constraints. And like everything else in Africa, the Sscft appears to put the cart before the horse. The infrastructure deficit have not been addressed. Okay. And there's no systematic programming within the Sscft to address that deficit. The second thing is that, see, the Sscft is coming at a time when countries have become committed in various trade agreements. So today, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire has an interim trade partnership agreement with the European Union that actually liberalizes 80% of our goods. With the onset of Brexit, just about a month ago, Ghana has signed a new agreement with the British. That agreement was never made public to the Ghanaian. It was never made known to the Ghanaian public. It has been ratified in Parliament. Nobody knows exactly what is in it. In fact, I called the Trade Ministry that I want a copy of it. They said that it's a secret document. Unfortunately for them, actually, the document is on the internet. I don't know how it became secret for them. Now, what happens if Ghana liberalizes its trade with the rest of Africa? Somewhere in the Economic Partnership Agreement, it is stated clearly that whatever trade preferences Ghana gives to its trading partners, the European Union will take advantage of it. So did we go or did we come? So this approach of zero barriers means that you are not removing the barriers only for Togo or for Namibia. In fact, you are removing the barriers so that the European Union, the single most important trading bloc in the world, will also take advantage of it. I mean, we like the Sscft, the principles behind it, but there are so many challenges we need to sit and discuss and address before full implementation takes place. Because what is likely to happen is that eventually, given the low productive capacity we have on the continent, given the infrastructural constraints we have, the Europeans and the Chinese will take advantage of the market we have. Already, remember, Africa is more or less a giant supermarket for the rest of the world. Thank you.
And then just if you could also answer this. So beyond the trade unions, disagreements or differences amongst actual traders. So what has already been alluded to between Ghanaian and Nigerian traders, and then perhaps some of the other speakers could come in with that in other regions, and just the impact of that.
I mean, between Ghana and Nigeria, for instance, I mean, sometimes it is more even political than actual differences between businesses. So it is actually Nigerian traders who come here and buy, say, tin tomatoes. But when it gets to Nigeria, the Nigerian government tells you that this tin tomatoes you are bringing did not originate from Ghana. It originated from somewhere in northern Italy, where Ghanaian importers actually lifted mountains of tomato paste and only put them in cans in Ghana. And that's the question we need to answer about rules of origin. Making sure that the goods actually originated within the Sscft region. We are here to define those kinds of rules. Okay. There are also petty, like the Ghanaian traders locking up the shops of Nigerian traders. When in fact, within the ECOWAS treaty, there's something we call the right of establishment by ECOWAS nationals. So Nigerian nationals have a right of establishment in Ghana. Somehow, we've all tolerated it, that the Ghanaians have a right to lock up the Nigerians. If they do the same in Lagos and in Abuja, it tells you that we are implementing the Sscft at a time when, in fact, the regional groupings themselves are locked up in problems.
Thank you. I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to come in on that. There is also a question. We will get to more of the questions in the chat, but there is just one that asks about, let me just get to it. How does the local content policies in our respective countries affect the implementation of the Afcfta? So if anyone wants to come in either on that issue of disagreements between traders, but also on this issue of local content policies, feel free to, you can just unmute yourself. Dr. Cooper, I see you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. The main question we really need to start asking, and we really have to start ask realistically, is whether this 2.4 trillion market is for Africans or for the international traders. And this cannot be said without reference to the infrastructure development, which is going on at a slow pace. But maybe one could also say thanks to China, who is actually really building this infrastructure, because I think this Sscft in a way is also operating on the infrastructure that is being built by through Chinese investments, which, mind you, are not local investments. And as Africans, we also need to be wary of geopolitical activities that are happening in light or within the talks of trade. Because if one also look at the Sscfta narrative, one get a sense that it's some kind of European war on the African continent against China, or American war against China on the African continent. Because when there is certain text which is there that really is problematic, and that's why an agreement ends up being ratified and only on few things that are agreed upon. For example, primary tariffs or non-tariff barriers and business and financial services. But then the continent is still negotiating on the rules of origin. And the planned negotiations about local content, or what we would like to even refer to as intellectual property rights or competition issues of investment measures and disputes are still planned to be discussed towards the end of this year or even coming next year. I mean, it may probably not be possible this year because of the COVID-19 dilemma. But in terms of the disagreements, there are fundamental questions that trade unions are asking, especially now that they have begun to engage on the subject of the Sscft, is whether certain fundamental issues are being addressed. Issues of child labor, issues of rights in terms of freedom of associations, issues of collecting bargaining within the sectors that now has been agreed upon. And we are not talking about the question of men and women, you know, the proportion of men and women in this whole agreement and the level of skills. We are not talking about the workings of the import and exporting sectors as we move on. So really, in one way, one would agree with Kwabena when he says that the cart is put before the horses, but maybe to say, since it's a ratified environment, what is it that we take out and how can we really take it forward as labor service organizations that are supporting trade unions or as trade unions? Because I think the war trade unions put on with respect to IPAS is quite commendable, and that's why certain things are not happening the way they have been envisaged before. So this conversation need to still need to be taken into consideration, and needs to happen in line with the activities that are already happening in the ICAS and the REX, and it should also be within. And it should also consider what Africans have already been trading to each other. Now, in the Southern African context, for example, you get a sense that South Africa remains the biggest supplier of trade in the sub-region, and that's why it's the piece of its pie in the within the SACU remuneration remains very high. And how is this really now going to play out when the Sscft is not quite clearly defined in terms of which rules it's going to follow? And as I said earlier, it seems to be leaning to the SACU rules of operation. I think these are some of the issues trade unions still needs to begin to engage with government. And I think in our own case now, the Ministry of Trade is beginning to really engage with trade unions. But it's not because they came themselves, it's because trade unions had to go to government and start to talk and to say, you can no longer leave us behind when you're dealing with issues that pertains to the world of work, and you're not involving the workers to also deliberate in these activities. I thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nikolai.
Sure, come in.
Yeah, just some few comments on some of the issues you've asked and what my colleagues have mentioned. I think it's also important to look at the background of our economies. I come from East Africa, where over 80% of the economy is in the informal sector, or is in the informal economy. And out of the 6 East African countries, 4 have ratified the Continental Free Trade Agreement. That's Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and just a few days, Tanzania. So I think moving forward, one of the main challenge in terms of the Sscft lies in the interface between the terms of the protocol already adopted. And this also is partly answers the question that you raised in terms of local content and other policies and initiatives that already exist. And this brings in, the policies that already exist at national, regional, and continental level. those that need to be put in place to build, and particularly looking at productive capacity. Since we are looking at a continent that has high informality, so how is the Continental Free Trade Area going to build productive capacities in domestic economics and to ensure that domestic producers, traders, workers, farmers, and other operators within the region are the main beneficiaries, but also are the drivers of this integration or transformation. And some of the policies, I would just like to mention policies like our trade policies. What does your country trade policy say? And is it aligned to the Sscft? Because if I take ESC as an example, once we agree on the different stages of integration, the customs union, the common market protocol, the next point is for countries to align their national policies to these protocols that have been agreed on at the EAC level. So in terms of countries, you will now be asking yourself, once you've ratified, what does the trade policy say? Does it speak to implementing the Continental Free Trade Agreement? If not, then there need to be some kind of harmonization, some kind of alignment, and some kind of review. But also, just to add to the mix, there are other policies or initiatives. For East Africa, we already have what we call the tripartite, and the tripartite free trade agreement is a free trade agreement between COMESA, EAC, and SADC. So how does this agreement play in relation to the Continental Free Trade Agreement? We have the African mining vision that is in place at the EU. We have the comprehensive African agricultural development program. We have an action plan to boost inter-African trade. So how do these different policies? So the question, I'm very glad the participant brought about the issue of local content. So it's not only at local level, but it's still also at the sub-regional level, because it brings about an issue that I raised earlier, the issue of does the Sscft issue around the enabling environment for Africa to have a policy space meant to enable domestic producers and other economic operators, especially those from vulnerable and fragile sectors, to benefit from the continental world free trade agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you to the panelists who seem to be answering some of the questions already, because there's a lot. I'm going to call on Hamida to answer the one question, which is relating to whether African countries are benefiting from liberalization in the movements of goods and services within the EU, and if not, how are they restricting our access, and what stops us from replicating their policies? And maybe, Hamida, if you don't mind, you could also touch on another question, because it's links to what you spoke to, which was regards to whether member states are putting in place structures to manage manufacturing and quality control. So you're speaking about the big lack of quality control across borders. So if you could speak to any of those.
Sure. So let me start with the second one first, because it's easier. So I don't think that we're putting in the necessary controls that is required for us to be able to ensure that when we're moving goods between. And I mean, I think as I mentioned, the issue around the chicken that's coming in, when South Africa or countries generally are wanting to do trade across borders, in terms of, we contest the issue of privatization. So what the modus operandi seems to be, you get a private company, which is usually a foreign company, and basically they would sign the agreement, or they would do the oversight between the country that is exporting the good and the country that's now the problem is we know, and I mean, you just take South Africa as an example in relation to corruption, right? But within government itself and the levels of tenders or tenderpreneurship, if you look at the issues around COVID, there's been so much of corruption internally. So when it comes to our borders and movement of goods between the borders, this is going to be exacerbated. I mean, if you just take Bay Bridge, the amount of goods moving between South Africa and Zimbabwe, right, or South Africa and Botswana, but South Africa and Lesotho, or Mozambique. I mean, with the levels of desperation and poverty, you just place something in somebody's hand and things move. I mean, recently I saw a notice where they were saying that in terms of cigarettes, I mean, when South Africa had its COVID ban and we had the lockdown, one of the key issues was cigarettes that you were not allowed to, weren't able to purchase from a shop. But the black market, and inverted commas, the informal or illegal market on cigarettes and tobacco had just gone through the roof, and the amount of profits that were made by people who were actually selling cigarettes illegally escalated. So clearly we're not doing the necessary, and the more deprivation and the more desperate people are going to become, the more goods are going to move. What's going to happen is also we're going to see protectionism of a different kind. So while the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is wanting to facilitate process of cross borders, we're supposed to have the same, we're supposed to have an African passport, we're supposed to be able to use our currencies across. If you look at the xenophobic attacks in South Africa in particular, I mean, when you have poverty and you have ministers who irresponsibly speak to the challenges that the country is facing and not placing the responsibility to the, around, or saying, look, the actual problem is our macroeconomic framework, the fact that we're choosing austerity in a context of recession, but you say it's our foreigners. We're keeping, every time you see foreigners coming in, they're in our schools, they're in our hospitals, they're placing stress on our water services. And more importantly, everywhere you go, you find a foreigner who's versatile, and they're willing to earn less money than a gardener or a plumber or whatever, a bricklayer in South Africa. Therefore, they're the problem. So when you give that script, it just undermines the whole notion of regional integration and us belonging to a continent and African citizenry. And so we're going to, in a context of poverty and deprivation, which is we've seen in the context of COVID, it has already been exacerbated. We're going to be fighting amongst ourselves as Africans rather than actually being pulled together. So I think this is going to be a fundamental challenge. I think a case in point, and I think Caroline raised it, and it's actually a point I wanted to raise. West Africa, I think Senegal actually had developed something like it's not an incubator, but I think they were actually putting people on ventilators. It was a public ventilator that was created in a public hospital. They also had really positive ways of treating COVID patients, and this was during the first wave in terms of last year. But the prominence of how Senegalese doctors and nurses were actually addressing and responding to COVID did not hit the news because they're not major pharmaceutical companies. They're not Johnson & Johnson, right? They're not Pfizer. They're not Moderna. So the problem is the possibilities of African innovation is going to be lost as a result of what we're currently seeing. On the second question, my good God, I was going to say, has the person actually taken a picture? If you just type in France or type in Germany and just have a look at how wonderfully lavish those countries are, and then you ask the question again. I mean, our poverty has been perpetuated in Africa for centuries. And these are because, I mean, it's not just the EU. The EU is a fundamental part of the negotiations at the multilateral trade agreement level. I'll give you an example. And I mean, I raised this at one of the WTO meetings, and one of the WTO officials was very, very upset with me. I mean, the EU subsidizes a cow in Europe, way higher than what a child in Africa would be able to earn. I mean, most people in Africa earn less than $1 a day. A cow is highly subsidized by virtue of the fact that the European Union is able to, by virtue of its power and because of its subsidies in the context of agriculture, actually provide subsidies, whereas we can't. I mean, our goods, our agricultural produce, even if you're talking about coffee, we specialize in the beans, but we're not able to move to a level where we're able to have the transfer of information. I mean, if you just look at the issues, I mean, in terms of, just take France as a simple example in West Africa, right? How is it that West Africa has all these natural mineral resources, but all that's happening is that the mineral resources are leaving the continent in its raw form and coming back processed? Why has West Africa not developed its manufacturing capacity? Why is it that when you go into West Africa, you do not see jam manufactured in Ghana or manufactured in Senegal? When you look at medication, there's not a single medication that's not coming from France. The entire currency is owned by the EU. So when you ask the question, why is it that we can't do the same? Come on, it's political. The power relations are absolutely unequal. And if you just look at the issue of the WTO, it's supposed to be based on democracy, meaning that every country who's there has the right to vote, right? Africans and developing countries are in the majority. Do you know that we've never ever voted? The WTO has never ever gone to a vote because the processes and the power relations that happen behind the scenes do not allow for it. And we as Africans, unfortunately, rather than coming together and collectively engaging as a collective, because we own the resources, go and negotiate for a pittance, and we get divided. So, you know, from a trade union perspective, we always say, united we stand, divided we fall, right? That's what happens every single time especially when you go to these negotiations and you see how, you know, the power and vested interest, and we're not talking about small changes, this is massive amounts of money, it's power owned by multinational corporations. And unfortunately, as African countries, we own the resources, but we do not realize the power that we have to be able to negotiate. We give it away too freely. So unfortunately, the power relations in the current global context is against us. And unless civil society organizations, and I think our trade unions, south to south, north to south engagements, and I mean, there's a whole lot of partnerships and networks that have grown. And I think in terms of the climate issue, I mean, as there's galvanizing around the climate issue, there's possibilities for really strategic kinds of engagements to be able to change or influence the current balance of forces. But replicating what the EU does in Africa, not a chance. As cynical as it is, it's really, I'm saying it with, you know, laughing, but it's absolutely painful. I really wish. Thanks.
Thank you.
Let me help Hamida. She was talking about the subsidies in the European Union. According to the UNDP, in 2003, cattle farmers in the EU were receiving $2 a day per cow. So to support them, I mean, $2, in fact, €2 a day per cow. What it meant was that the cattle subsidy in the European Union was higher than the minimum wage in Ghana at the time, okay, which we pay to human beings as workers, okay. Now, there's no way you can compete with the European Union when it comes to dairy products, okay. The second point I want to make is about, somebody asked about local content. So if, for example, you take Nigeria, you can only sell chicken in Nigeria if you produce it in Nigeria. So it's only something that has been halved for Nigerian citizens. So if you're a company in Nigeria, you can. So what Nigeria could do under the Sscft agreement is to put the chicken under what they call the sensitive list. So even though countries are liberalizing, they are allowed to keep, I think, 10% of their product lines unliberalized, a sensitive list. These are products that are deemed to be important for, say, poverty reduction for women empowerment and stuff, so you don't liberalize them. Okay. And this is also another area. In some countries, you have rigorous studies that are done to determine what will be those sensitive lists. So far, you don't know. I don't know what Ghana has done to define those sensitive lists. I don't know whether my colleagues know what South Africa has done or what Namibia has done. So that is the way to deal with the local content. You place it under your sensitive list product. And then the question about women. If trade liberalization leads to losses and job losses, they increase the burden for women on caring for families. I mean, if the man loses their job, they come back home and play draft. The women will have to figure out how to feed them and their families. So the literature on trade liberalization is that as the moment they lead to job losses, they increase the pressure on women. The unpaid work for women go up, and it in a way lead to subjugation of women across board. And I expect that the Sscft will do the same for countries that lose out on liberalization. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. Yeah, there's been so much food for thought. There's a lot of different directions I could definitely continue the conversation in. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to please give maybe some concluding thoughts. And thinking about, that there is massive momentum behind the Afcfta. It's here. People describe it as kind of a groundswell that people are very taken up by. So what do unions do? What does the labor movement do? And where do we go in terms of protecting workers' rights? Whoever wants to come in first can go. Dr. Tu, if you want to, you're welcome to come in.
I think the first thing we need to do is for all of us to get interested, take the agreement and read them. I mean, the International Trade Union Confederation African Regional Office, what we call the ITUC Africa, has begun a study looking at the impact of the Sscft on employment and labor rights, but also broadly on development across Africa in general. It is important that we carry through that research and get the facts to be able to support our advocacy work on the Sscft. But I think the Sscft Secretariat itself must begin to engage. We have made approaches to the Secretariat to meet them. So far, they are not forthcoming. We think that they should be able to. They must begin the process of engagement. And that engagement must help them to define rules of origin that is watertight enough, so that we deflect the possibility of trade diversion or trade capture by the powerful countries of the world. We also, as part of the Sscft, need to define a compensatory mechanism. That the countries that lose out, we should find a way of compensating them. Otherwise, they will become the stumbling block to the effective implementation of the agreement. And then my last point is about the conscious process of dialogue around the whole the whole agreement. It's both for employers and also for trade unions. Businesses that want to export under the agreement must have full information. They must be consulted. They must have their questions answered to be able to take advantage of the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would anyone like to come in?
Yes,
Dr. Cooper.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Kwabena has pretty summed it up very well. But I think the most important thing that needs to be done here is to intensify the engagement within trade unions, and the governments must not only act in a way where they seem not to be engaging. That said, it's also applicable to the Secretariat, that when the Secretariat is moving around the continent, engaging with RECs, they must also consider engaging with trade unions. And I think this is all about the relationship between the Secretariat and the governments and even the regional economic bodies, how they are engaging. Have they already been engaging with labor? The issue here is no. And I think most importantly here, the Ministry of Labor needs to come on board, because ministries of labor on the continent seems to lag behind when important topics such as this are being engaged. And it's high time that they really come to the table so that that kind of dialogue can really take effect, so that all parties engage in this in matters of the trade agreement. The issue of women cannot be overemphasized. It just needs to be actually brought out there so that we see what the effects are going to be. And this is really going to come out in the studies that have been referred to by Kwabena as well. So I think that will be our last input for the evening from our side here in Windhoek. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hamida or Caroline, you in?
Oh, I can go first. I think I'll finish up by also trying to answer the question on the role of women in successful achievement of the Sscft. I think two things come in my mind when you talk about women and cross and the Sscft. I think the first thing is looking at the role that women have played over the period within women informal cross-border traders. How does the African Continental Free Trade Agreement strengthen this process or make that kind of trade easier? Because the majority of the informal cross-trade borders is done by women traders. And then the other thing also that I think Hamida or Dr. Otto mentioned at the beginning of the meeting was the issue around value chain. So there's still, we need to have a proper analysis of the role of gender, women, and value chains to ensure that the role of women is properly taken care of. But in terms of concluding, I think for me, it's just looking at we as trade unions, challenge for labor interest within the process that is happening. And how can we do this? Through research. My colleagues have already talked about the researches that are already going on through networking. We have mentioned that we've done a lot of work. We've gotten a lot of support from Third World Network, issues around constituency building in terms of ensuring that our constituencies and our members actually understand what the whole Continental Free Trade Agreement is, and particularly for the sectors that have been prioritized, particularly when you're looking around free movement of services, also looking at how they will be, either positively or negatively affected. The issue around policy engagement, and the policy engagement means we need to already have these policy proposals in place, and this is what the process that we are currently working with together with ITUC Africa, trying to come up with a position of trade unions on Sscft at the continental level. And all these processes for the trade unions are geared towards, concrete contribution and instances of job creation and development of decent livelihood, because that's the core mandate of the trade unions in terms of driving decent jobs. And thank you, and I'm really privileged to have been given the opportunity to share our thoughts at these forums, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Comrade Caroline. So maybe just, I mean, Nicola, I won't, I think comrades have spoken, and I have spoken to some of the issues in relation to, what trade unions can do. I think I just want to pick up on a couple of issues that are coming in the chat, and I must say I'm quite nervous. I mean, there's a question in relation to, something called best practice around how the EU is keeping Eastern European countries out. Eastern European countries have to jump through. Comrades, people, we are talking about us as Africans on an African continent. How can the exclusion of Eastern Europeans into Europe be seen as the best practice? South Africa is xenophobic. We put up barriers for people from different parts of Africa to enter our country. I don't think that's a good practice. I think we should be talking about regional integration that's maximum beneficiation for us as a continent. So why do we not put up barriers for foreign direct investment that actually leads to underdevelopment in our country? So why are we not putting up hoops for China, for example, or American companies or German companies to come into our countries and exploit us? I don't think we should be Africa against Africa. I think, we need to be really critical, and this is not an opportunity. We shouldn't be using the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to become xenophobic or anti-African. I mean, if I think of a specific example, when Mosgas was in Mozambique many years ago, we had Mozambican workers and South African workers who were organized. So there was a union that was organizing the workers in Mozambique at Mosgas, and there was NUMSA that was organizing workers in South Africa. And because the conditions and the company was the same, the workers from NUMSA, as well as the workers from the union in Mozambique, came together. The two unions came together, we brought the workers together, and despite the fact that it was Mozambican workers and South African workers, they negotiated a wage deal that was beneficial and relative to the cost of living of both countries, without initiating competition between the workers, because that's what capital normally does. It plays workers against each other. It plays unions against each other, and xenophobic tendencies and small issues around differences, whether it's the color of your skin, the language that you speak, a particular culture that you follow. I mean, let's just think of Rwanda. The Hutus and the Tutsis lived next to each other for years. Somebody said something, and the next thing you had a massive war, and people and the devastation. And I mean, this is our history. You look at Uganda, you look at the Congo. I mean, we cannot allow agendas that are driven by capitalism and money and profiteering to rip us as a continent apart. I think the other concern that I have is, I mean, I don't think people understand what zero tariffs mean. I mean, can you imagine if you're a country and you rely on say 4 things that actually keep your economy going, right? So you produce for your local market, and you export, and that's what keeps your GDP, and it gives your government an income in order to pay for education, for water services, roads, etc. If you're saying zero tariff, it means that the countries in Africa and the world will be able to bring their products into your country at zero cost. They're not going to be taxed. And if they are subsidized, so think about it. Think of Massmart. Massmart has a power greater than many local supermarkets. The purchasing power of something like Massmart, and it doesn't have to be foreign. South African companies do this, right? If you have purchasing power, you're able to bring in a product and you undercut the price of a domestic product in a domestic country. That's how you kill competition, and that's how you destroy local markets. If your economy does not have a backup, you will be dependent on everything being sourced externally. African workers will be located in an informal economy. We cannot be specializing in poverty. So zero tariffs without actually doing research, without looking at which sectors, without looking at safeguarding mechanisms. I mean, Caroline has mentioned the issue that the least developed countries will have 10 years, but the rest of us have 5 years. I mean, 5 years for every single sector to be opened. Imagine and this is also finance. So banks, roads, water, electricity, everything is open up to the market. Your government will not have a single thing I mean, Kwabena had raised the fact that there would be certain limitations that you'd have up to a certain point. But those sectors, over a certain period of time, are also going to have to wither away their tariffs and their barriers. So this is deregulation and liberalization of its worst form. We are not at that level. We are never going to be able to. I mean, every country, and I mean, I think comrades should actually go and read. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's a book called Kicking the Ladder. And I think if you read that book, you will see that every single country, in order to develop, needs to have two specific mechanisms: liberalization and protectionism, which are interchanged within your economy at a pace determined by your specific government to ensure that your economy develops. No country has ever developed and become a developed country based on liberalization. I think Kwabena has raised that, and he said liberalization as a tool for development is a myth. And zero tariff barriers in the context of Afcfta to bring about regional integration and beneficiation for Africa is a misnomer. It's fundamentally flawed. And I think we really, I mean, it's a pity that, we can go on and on. For those of us who know this, we can go on forever, but it's really a nightmare. And I'm really worried by some of the questions that are being raised, because I don't think people are fully comprehending the challenges and the difficulties that we are going to be confronted once this particular agreement is going to be implemented. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think also what you're alluding to is that for many of us, there's very powerful messaging and very unified messaging, which we don't have about a lot of things, and we do have about the Xenophobic. So it's important for us to learn the complexities. And then just the book, I think it's by Hajun Chang, The Kicking Away the Ladder. But thank you so much to the speakers. This has been really, really challenged me in so many ways and pushed me, and I've learned a lot. I'd love to hand over to Ms. Akusua Asasante, who is a lecturer at the UPSA Law School, to do some closing remarks, and then we will wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I must say that this has been a very insightful exposure for most of us. It's a bit scary, but I'm sure that we'll be able to surmount it. But the issue of inter and intra trade liberalization, we have seen this evening the challenges that are supposed, or that are meant to come out. And of course, we have always believed that our trade unions on the continent have always been vibrant. Dr. Otu said it earlier on. And the African Union has actually recognized the critical role that the labor movement does in Africa. We are expecting the trade unions to engage in vigorous discussions with the powers that be. Otherwise, at the end of the day, it's the ordinary worker who is going to be affected when we are being choked by everything being bombarded on us. I don't think it will be funny for all of us, especially workers. So trade union, thank you very much. But we would expect you to have vigorous engagement with our leaders, the political leaders especially, who will be signing the agreement. And please engage some other civil society organizations to speak for us. We are at your mercy. But this evening, we are so grateful to you, Trade Union Ghana, for your time, for every effort you've made in putting up this session. Dr. Ba and his team, thank you very much. We also want to thank our panelists, Hamida, Dr. Akupa, Dr. Otu, and Caroline. Thank you very much for sharing your rich experiences and a narrative from different backgrounds with us. We won't take that for granted. We are so grateful. Thank you very much, Nicola. I learned you had less than a week to put this one up, but thank you, you are here, and you've shepherded the program amazingly well. We are so grateful. We would also like to thank our Dean. I'm sure Prof is here, Prof Abuchi, thank you very much. To our head of department, Dr. Franca, To our Director of the Legal Center, thank you. Our coordinator, Ms. Getty, if you are here, we are saying thank you very much to you. We'd like to thank Ms. Marian Atuguba. Marian, thank you very much for the effort you've made in making this show a success. We'd also like to thank the faculty members, our student body, thank you for attending. We thank the members from the academia environment and of course, labor environment. Thank you very much. Finally, but not the least, Joy FM business team, you have given us a huge platform that we are so grateful to you for. Thank you for always coming to our aid. And we thank you for the adverts you've been doing, even before the time of the programs. To everybody here, we are so grateful. I am sure that we are looking forward to having another exciting roundtable discussion. This, to me personally, has been something else. And I'm sure your doors are open to most of us. Our students are here. And I'm sure the questions they are asking on their platform and the contributions, it tells me as a labor teacher that, hey, something good is happening. But I also like to say that this is an opportunity for us as Africans. It is our time to make the difference and to change the narrative. Until we meet again, thank you, everybody, and blessed night.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, my comrades.